On to Mark chapter 9 today. Mark chapter 9 again in this chunk of 8, 9, and 10 where the drumbeat of the cross is growing louder and louder. And I have to say, Mark chapters 9 and 10 have become, I think, my absolute favorites in this book. There is just so much in these chapters and such fascinating things for us to ponder. Mark chapter 9 begins with the Transfiguration, and maybe you're thinking, I thought this was about the cross, but it's not. This is about Jesus in his glory. Well, yeah, the disciples, Peter, James, and John, they got to see Jesus in his glory. They got to see Elijah and Moses there talking with Jesus. But this is not an account solely about the glory of Christ. Sure, he has his glory, and yet really this account too is focused on the cross. Now, Mark doesn't tell us this, but we're told this in the other Gospels, that Jesus was discussing with Elijah and Moses his coming departure in Jerusalem. So what's going on? Well, they are seeing the glory. Jesus is seeing the cross. He's talking about his suffering and death once again. Now, Peter sees all of this glory, and of course, what does he want to do? He wants to stay here. Why not? Something really cool is going on. Peter didn't really know what to say. It says they were terrified, and then it gets even worse when the cloud overshadows them. The Father says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And the disciples are on the ground quaking in fear. Is this about God's glory or about the cross? Well, here, how does God reveal himself? Suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, but Jesus only. That's such a beautiful little phrase, that our God, on whom none of us could ever look without just dying instantly in all of his glory, our God chooses to hide himself in human flesh and blood so that in the person of Jesus we can see him. And we see this beautiful little statement here, that in the midst of the terror that those disciples felt, they look up and they lay their eyes on Jesus, and they have peace and comfort and calm. Our God has come to dwell with us in the same way that we look on Jesus as he comes and hides himself in his word and in his sacraments, so that our God, who is so far above us, should be here right next to us, with us always to the very end of the age. So then they start heading down the mountain, and notice what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about his suffering and death and resurrection. So this is at least the second, if not the third time that Jesus has talked about it. Third, if you count his conversation with Moses and Elijah. Jesus is focused on the cross. Now, the disciples, they're saying, what's this rising from the dead mean? Why? What in the world is going on? And they're trying to sort this out. They're still kind of trying to figure out or piece together who Jesus is or how this is all going to work. Why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? Jesus says, yeah, this is what was written, but understand this, that John the Baptist is not physically Elijah. He is John, not Elijah, come back. And yet he is the fulfillment of that prophecy, Elijah, the messenger who would come before the face of the Lord. And what happened? Well, it's the cross. The great messenger, John the Baptist, came. They did to him whatever they pleased, as we've already learned that John lost his head, not as a sign of God's displeasure with him, but actually a sign of his favor and love, that no one is more honored than John the Baptist, and yet he was treated with contempt. Well, what do you expect? If you would come after me, take up your cross and follow me, right? So after this scene of glory on the mountain, Jesus and the disciples come down, and now we get to this really neat account. They come down, and you just have to think that after that mountaintop experience, Jesus sees the crowd and the argument going on, and he just thinks, oh man, what have my disciples gotten themselves into? The crowd comes and they run up to him. They're really excited to see Jesus, and Jesus says, what are you arguing about? Someone from the crowd tells him, teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. It seizes him, throws him down. He foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. And Jesus says, almost in lamentation here, oh, faithless generation, how long must I be with you? Bring him to me. So they do. They bring the boy to him, and the spirit goes into action. And Jesus, such compassion. So now he turns to this father and he says, how long has this been happening to him? And we hear this father from the torment of his heart saying, from childhood. And it's often been so bad. This demon has tried to destroy my child. this, sometimes people say, oh, these people didn't understand seizures, or they didn't understand mental health crises or things like that, or stuff that's what this is. No, this is different. This is a demon possessing the child, so it's not exactly the same. But we do know this, that the demons like to see people harming themselves. The demons try to prod and urge people with mental health afflictions on to hurting and harming themselves. So that is in league with Satan. And God, of course, comes to deliver us from self-destruction. The man says, but if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus says, well, hold on a second. What did you say? Did you say if? If you can? If you can? No, no, no. All things are possible for one who believes. If you can? No, that's not the case. Don't you believe that I am the Christ? Well, the Father has another one of these short and beautiful prayers, a prayer that each one of us needs to pray. Jesus, I believe, help my unbelief. That's literally what it says. Some translations say, help me overcome my unbelief. That's really not a good translation. This is not like, Jesus, help me get over the hump. This is like, Jesus, on my own, I would just be stuck in unbelief, but help me. And what does Jesus do? He says, absolutely. I believe, help my unbelief. Of course. So the crowd comes running together. Jesus says, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. Now, Jesus has given us interesting insight into the spirit. The spirit was mute and deaf. Do you suppose that maybe the disciples who couldn't cast this demon out were talking to it? Well, it's a deaf spirit. It can't hear. But of course, everybody hears the mighty and powerful word of God. Jesus on the last day is going to speak to the dead, and they will hear and listen. And what happens? The boy is convulsed so terribly that he comes out looking like he's dead. But Jesus sees through it. This is not death. He takes him by the hand, lifts him up, and gives him back to his father. And imagine the joy in that father's house. The disciples are saying, why? Why couldn't we cast it out? He said, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. You're not going to be able to command this demon and it's going to be gone because it's a deaf spirit. Only God has that power with his word. Then what happens? Notice the heading. Jesus again foretells his death and resurrection. As if they didn't get it yet, they're going to get it drilled home. The drumbeat of the cross is growing louder and louder and louder. So by my count, this is at least the third, if not the fourth time, again, depending on how you count the Mount of Transfiguration, that Jesus is talking about the events of Holy Week, his suffering and death and his resurrection. And still the disciples don't get it. They haven't yet grasped the cross. Instead, what do the disciples want? Well, they want to be greatest. So they're arguing about it. They're still hooked on making a name for themselves, on glory here and now. And Jesus says, no, 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 that's not the way in my kingdom. You must deny yourself, make yourself last, the servant of all, and come follow me. And make yourself like a child. The nature of a child is to receive. So receive me in joy. We go on. There's a couple more things in Mark chapter 9. But I see that I am pressing up against my time. So we're going to leave it there. Again, it's just such rich chapters 9 and 10. Looking forward to going through chapter 10 with you tomorrow. God bless you.